Welcome to Wizards of the Tower.
Roleplay.
In this episode, we're going to be talking CRPG, or Computer Role-Playing Games. Welcome to Wizards of the Tower.
Roleplay.
And we're going to be talking about computer role-playing games. And one reason why we're doing it is the release of Baldur's Gate 3 just happened.
Yep.
So I played it a little bit before release, and now that it's full release, I've jumped into it.
Yeah, I've been watching Delaney play it, and it's a really amazing, intense game. A lot of cutscenes.
Yeah.
It's very sort of a modern game. So let me ask you this: what was really the first computer role-playing game that you played?
Zork, on an Apple computer that my cousins had. We went to their house on a Thanksgiving and jumped on it and started playing Zork, and I was hooked. And even though it was very simple.
What is Zork?
Zork was this very simple stickman. No, actually, it wasn't Zork. It was the Temple of Apshai. But Zork was a text-based. It was one of the first RPGs in a text-based.
Okay.
You're walking down the woods. You come through to a split. What do? I'm taking the right path. Okay. You're walking along the right path, and you come across this old woman with an apple. What do?
Oh, okay.
So that was Zork, and then
Okay.
Zork got more advanced. But no, it was actually the Temple of Apshai.
Okay.
Which was a little stick figure, and there were these ant guys that you fought in the dungeon.
Man, I don't know anything.
Oh man,
about that.
it was a blast. I didn't want to give up playing that, and to go eat supper and then or dinner and then rush back up to log back in, and there was all these other kids, so you had to let them play too.
Man, I don't know anything about. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about that. I mean, my introduction to computer games has been fairly recent. When Delaney and I got together as a couple, she got me more into it. So you started out with the Temple of Apshai. What did it sort of evolve into then, when it's kept evolving?
So I wanted a computer for the longest time,
Right.
And then I finally got a Commodore 64 computer, and actually there was an Atari game that I had called Dungeon that was real basic. It really wasn't role playing. It was just a dungeon adventure.
Okay.
But it was very stripped down. But then when I got my Commodore 64, there were the Eye of the Beholder series,
okay,
and the Curse of the Azure Bonds, and the original. Well, the original Baldur's Gate was for PC, but there was Curse of the Azure Bonds and the Eye of the Beholder. And the Eye of the Beholder was this first person walking through this digital dungeon, and it was a blast. At the time it was.
Wow. You
look at it now and it's very dated, but
sure.
for the time it's like, wow, this is great. I get to go through a dungeon adventure, and I don't have to go to a friend's house to play. I can play it right here. I'd stay up till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh my goodness.
Playing, and then go to bed for a couple hours and get up and play again. And then Azure Bonds was, you create a little character, and it was this little 8-bit character that you moved around. You created a party, and you had your fighter and your wizard and your cleric and your thief, and they did things. And so that was my first introduction, really, into computer role-playing games.
So give me a timeline. When was that?
Oh, gosh. So let's see. Temple of Apshai would have been with the original Apple computer. So that would have been...
Commodore 64?
The Commodore 64 would have been, I think, around 83, 45, I think.
Wow.
I'll have to put up a date for that, because I was out of high school when I finally got my Commodore 64. There was the Commodore VIC-20, but it was even older. But the Commodore 64 had color.
Right.
And there were all these really cool computer games, and those are the ones that I played the most.
I seem to remember. I didn't know a lot of people in high school who had computers, but I do remember the first very primitive computer games that people were playing, and they were essentially on cassette tape. And that's how the computer had its memory.
Right, that was like the VIC-20s
Yeah,
and the TSR-80s.
It went back through this cassette tape and rolled it back and forth, and that was its memory.
Yep.
And I remember there were games on that. I remember my friends were playing that. And I remember everybody, when they got the Commodore 64, they were just yelling about it because it was so light years advanced from the others. So we're talking the 80s now. And
right.
Well, they must have advanced fairly quickly, right?
I wouldn't say advanced quickly, because with the Commodore, then we moved into the 286, 386, 486 computer,
Okay.
which was, still kind of an 8-bit technology. The graphics weren't that great.
Yeah. So can you give me an idea what is the difference between like a computer role-playing game and just a basic computer game?
So a role-playing game is, once again, it's like when you're playing a tabletop game. You take on the role of a character.
Okay.
Whether it's a fantasy or it's a sci-fi or some other kind of game. Now there were King's Quest, which were kind of a role-playing game in a way, but they were very limited and linear.
Okay.
And you only were given certain kind of options. You only had one character that you had, so you really weren't taking on the role. Whereas the Eye of the Beholder and Curse of the Azure Bonds, you actually started taking on the role of a party.
Okay.
And you had your choices. You'd come up to a door and it would give you 4 choices. What are you going to do? And then it would roll the dice and determine what you did.
Okay. No, I begin to see like the evolution of games like that when you get dialogue choices.
Right.
And each one is radically different from the others. There's always like a good one, a really bad one, and 2 like intermediate ones that you can choose. That'll determine the direction of the game that you're going in. So I tend to think of those as kind of like role-playing games on a computer.
Yeah, and then we moved into the Icewind Dale series and the Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 series, and then Neverwinter Nights, which turned into, you could actually play multiplayer.
Now it's Neverwinter Nights 2. I played a lot of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And as it got more advanced, you moved into the Bethesda Elder Scroll games and the Morrowind and Skyrim. Skyrim kind of really set a lot of standards. Wizardry actually was even bigger at the time, and I think that would have set the standard more even than what Skyrim.
What is Wizardry?
Wizardry was a first person. It was like the Eye of the Beholder once again, and you would move down alleyways, these block alleyways.
Okay.
So you'd move and you'd come up with choices, and you'd have fights, and you'd roll. The computer would roll the dice, your combat, and you had your character group and your party.
Okay, yeah.
So it was more in depth, but you had a party of like 1 to 6 players.
Okay.
Whereas when you got into Morrowind, it was a single.
It's single. Yeah.
It's you alone.
First
you
person.
against the world.
Yeah, first person.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you can have a follower. You came up with followers finally, and like in Fallout 3, I think you had Dogmeat.
Well, original Fallout 1 and 2, you had Dogmeat.
You did? Okay.
Yeah, and then you could get other followers to kind of join you along for one other person with you.
Yeah, in Skyrim, of course, you've got followers. In Fallout 4, you can create your own robotic followers, that kind of thing. So, computer role-playing games, now, it's so popular, it's beyond comprehension. I mean, people of all ages play them.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to people who were in their 50s and 60s and 70s, who play a lot of the games and computer games and stuff, and they always have dialogue that they talk about, and like they quote specific dialogue from games and things like that. So it's become worldwide. It's a worldwide phenomenon.
Somebody stole my sweet roll.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And
it used to be an adventure, and then I took an arrow to the knee.
Right. There's these language choices and stuff that come up. When you were playing the earlier ones, did you ever think that they would get that big?
I knew that they would stick around because role-playing, tabletop RPGs really advanced and really created the computer role-playing game. Without Dungeons and Dragons, you wouldn't have the computer role-playing games that we have.
Now, there was a D&D computer role-playing game, wasn't there?
Well, that's what the Eye of the Beholder and the Curse of the Azure
Okay,
Bonds
okay.
were all. Those were all D&D, and they
were
were
D&D.
done by TSR.
Okay.
Yeah, they were
Okay.
done by TSR and SSI Games.
Okay, so we both read quite a bit about TSR and Gary Gygax and the rise and fall of D&D and that sort of thing. And I remember people in the books complaining about how they were putting a lot of money into these computer games, and some people said they were going to fail and they were never going to go anywhere and they were wasting the money. And other people were like, yeah, we got to go with computers because people were combining role-playing games and computer technology or putting them together, and that's the wave of the future. Some people would just refuse to admit that the two of them would ever work. You know, they think it's like the new Coke of the generation. It's like,
Well,
it just isn't going to work.
And then it broke away into the massively multiplayer
Yeah.
online role-playing game, even though I never saw them as role-playing games, they were called that, with EverQuest.
But they are, right? Because people like you and I,
They can be, yes.
people like you and I would go. I mean, I didn't ever play those games. I never did because I just never had a computer until much later. But people would go on in those multiplayer games and they would assume a role.
Yes.
And they would, so they were role-playing games in that sense that they would assume a role and they would play the game as a princess or a prince or a king or a warrior. It doesn't mean they were actually a warrior or a princess. They would assume that role.
Yeah. Ultima series. The Ultima 1, 2, 3 from Lord British Games was huge.
Oh.
They were actually even a predecessor before the Eye of the Beholder games.
Okay.
They were around the time of, right after Temple of Apshai and Wizardry. Wizardry and Ultima came around about in the same time.
So, is it fair to say that like the really big computer role-playing game that came out was World of Warcraft, like the totally immersive?
EverQuest was actually probably the first.
EverQuest,
and then it broke away. You had there were other ones, but then World of Warcraft came out, and World of Warcraft was huge, and it's still huge. You know, and then you got EVE Online, and you know, it's just endless now with the massively multiplayer online games.
Yeah.
Star Citizen is another one.
Yeah.
Which I don't see a whole lot of role playing in it, but it is a form of role playing.
Well, some of the games have a lot of very, very extensive role play in them, and other games don't have a lot of it. But like the dialogue choices, you can create your own dialogue. I tend to think that in the games that you can create your own dialogue, those are really role playing games.
Yes.
Because you're not following game dialogue, you're creating your own dialogue. So.
Right. You know, and they've just gotten more advanced. You know, Paizo came out with their Kingmaker.
Right, the Kingmaker,
which was their first one, which they kickstarted, which was a really good game, and it was huge. It was expansive.
Yeah.
And it was a throwback to the older style of games where it was isometric view instead of first-person view.
Yeah.
Kind of the throwback to the original Fallout games, which were isometric.
Isometric, yeah.
And you know, they went on. They have another one that they did, which I don't really care much for the Pathfinder games. Some people do. I played them for a long time, but I just kind of found that I would get stuck in them.
Yeah.
And you know, with 5th edition, then you had the Crown of Solasta, which was one of the most comprehensive 5e. It was more 5e than Baldur's Gate. In most ways, and it was the first one that actually allowed you to levitate and fly and spider climb, which was really an advancement into the game and the mechanics. And then, of course, you know, you get into, you know, Skyrim, which
there's Elder Scrolls Online too.
Elder Scrolls Online and Fallout 76, which is online.
That's online, yeah.
So the role playing has evolved, and it's still there. It's still really big. And of course, you know, Baldur's Gate just releasing, and then you've got Starfield coming out here,
right.
You know, shortly, or will be by the time this released, which people are anticipating because it's another Bethesda big monstrous role playing game with all your choices.
So I guess it's safe to say that the computer role playing game is probably here to stay, and of course it's morphing into something really, you know, in a few years it's going to morph into something else like a virtual reality game or virtual immersion game. Give it time, folks. Things evolve very quickly when it comes to tech, as we all know. It's going to become virtual immersion, and it's going to become you know, almost like those sci-fi movies you see on TV late at night, you know, that where people, you know, they become so virtually immersive in their games that they forget to eat and drink and they die, you know, and they're lost in their
Hopefully
game.
it never happens, but
Well, I mean, who can say? It can
it's
happen.
possible.
Yeah. So, popularity of role-playing games is people like to assume roles other than what they are. They like to think, you know, be a person. You know, a person can be a warrior, a person can be a magic user, you know, that sort of thing. And that just comes from the simple idea of role-playing games, tabletop RPGs in general, that people like to play in because they like to assume identities and realities.
Right.
You know, and computers just sort of, you know, hitched a ride on that at first, but now they're leading the way.
Yeah, and it's not just fantasy games. You've got the Fallouts where in a sci-fi game you had a Buck Rogers game.
Sure.
Which was a sci-fi game. You've got Star Citizen. You've got Cyberpunk. You've got Red Dead Redemption, which is a role-playing game.
Old West, you know.
You had Vampire the Masquerade.
Yeah.
Vampire, you know, which was a horror-based game.
So there's all sorts.
Yeah, there's all sorts. So it's expansive, and I think it's here to stay, and the VR part of it is going to be a whole other part of it.
It is. Give it a few years. And now VR is a little clunky right now because if anybody's ever used the VR headsets, they're a little clunky.
Unless you're doing flight sims.
But give technology a chance to evolve. It's going to be very close around the, you know, in the next 2 years that we're going to see an evolution of this as people begin to approach it from a different point of view and start solving these problems. Within the next 5 or 10 years, the VR role-playing games are going to be the standard. Trust me, it's going to happen.
Do you like playing computer role-playing games?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I don't get into them so much. I mean, you know, the things I like, of course, I like, you know, reading books and I like movies and stuff like that. And I like tabletop RPG for social interaction. I don't like so much spending a lot of time playing computer RPGs. Just because I like to limit myself to a few hours at a time. Mainly because, you know, I don't want to just spend so much time on one thing.
Yeah.
You know, I still find a great amount of pleasure in reading really good books or watching good movies or TV shows.
Or getting outside for a hike.
Yeah, or going
Very
outside.
Very important things, or bike ride.
Yeah, or going outside and doing, you know, physical activities, which I still love to do. I still love to do physical activities. However, I will say this, I'm not criticizing anybody who wants to live in a virtual world.
It's a form of escapism, just like tabletop RPGs.
Just like anything else. People, you know, it's easy to criticize someone for living in a virtual world, but unless you actually know the reasons they have and why they do certain things, and you're living in their life, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just criticize someone and say, you're living in a world of fantasy, dummy. You know, it's like, hey, come on, you know, don't say that because you're not living their life.
So it's funny you talk about virtual reality because I remember in the 80s the virtual reality centers that people could go to play games. Whether they were the BattleTech centers, and I played in a heavy metal band, and I actually wrote a song called Virtual Reality, and it was about living in this world of imagination, and we have actually come to that. That was back in 1983.
The only thing
it's funny.
The only thing that surprises me more about it is we haven't advanced farther.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, you know, our technological advancements are amazing with miniaturized electronics. I mean, they can do anything. So to me, it's sort of like, why haven't we advanced farther? I think it's because people are afraid to take those first big steps. But once we take those first big steps and we create virtual reality role-playing games that people can have for total immersion, once we take those first steps, no one's ever going to want to take those steps back.
So if you remember the TV show Caprica, the predecessor to Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, I remember that, Caprica.
The virtual reality world.
Yeah, that they lived in, that kind of steampunkish.
Yeah, the one girl died, but her essence was uploaded.
Her essence was in there. Yeah, and that's how they created the first Cylon.
Yeah,
is they took her essence back out of it and put it in a mechanical body because he wanted his daughter back, and he did that. He created her a mechanical body and brought her essence back out of the VR game and put it in the Cylon and created a mechanical version of his daughter. Yeah. A really interesting concept.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, We're going to end this episode of Wizards of the Tower.
Role play.
Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, spread the word, and if you have a favorite computer role-playing game that you like to play, or one that you're playing now, and why you like them or dislike them, and how you think they've evolved and how they've come about, let us know. We'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah.
So, anyway, may all your adventures be reality.
And keep on rolling, folks. Thank you.